Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are, and welcome to the series, Viewing Multidimensional Poverty from Many Angles. Coming to you from the George Washington University in Washington, DC, Oxford University in Oxford, UK, and the United Nations in New York City. This is the fourth episode of the present series, which explores the Multidimensional Poverty Index, or MPI, and how it can be used in theory and practice. I'm James Foster, Vice Dean of the Elliott School of International Affairs at the George Washington University, representing the Institute for International Economic Policy, or IIEP. I'm here with Ricardo Nogales and Jacob Dirksen of the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, or OPHI, in the Department of International Development of Oxford University. And along with our colleagues at Human Development Report Office of the UNDP, thought I saw Alberto there. We're pleased to offer today's presentation, Multidimensional Poverty in Brazil in the early 21st century, evidence from the Demographic Census. Today's presenter is Adriana Stankiewicz Serra of the University of Campinas. And the discussion will be provided by my good old friend, Inaki. How are you? Inaki Permanyer. Great to see you. Great. He's at the Center for Demographic Studies. And in just a moment, I'll ask Jacob to describe the series and introduce the speakers. But first, I'd like to express my appreciation to the teams at IIEP, OPHI, and HDRO for their continued help in making the series possible. And to offer a hearty congratulations to IIEP's Director, Jay Shambaugh, for being nominated by President Joe Biden to be the next Undersecretary for International Affairs in the US Treasury Department. This is, of course, a nomination. It needs to be confirmed, but I just wanted to congratulate for that important role. It really is a very, very strategic, key role at this difficult time, and Jay is singularly qualified for it. Of course, all eyes are turned east to recent events in Ukraine. Accordingly, the Elliott School of International Affairs will be offering its own in-house analysis featuring Elliott faculty and alumni discussing the conflict in Ukraine tomorrow, March 1st at 11:30 Eastern. Dean Alyssa Ayers will moderate a distinguished panel including alumnus Ambassador Kurt Volker, economist Mike Moore, security experts Charlie Glazer and Alex Downs, and regional specialist Marlene Leroux. In this week, IIEP has a multitude of great events. Following today's event, there's a Facing Inequality series, which features economic historian Trevon Logan, presenting Black politicians during Reconstruction, impacts and backlashes. On Wednesday, in our Envisioning India series, Anirudh Krishna of Duke University will present Understanding Poverty Dynamics and the Impact of the Pandemic. This is, of course, in the Indian subcontinent. This will be with discussion by OPHI's own Chris Oldages, now at UNDP, and Dr. Sekhar Bonu of India's Niti Aayog. Last week in the MPI series, Kendi Omotoshaw of the University of South Africa examined multidimensional poverty in South Africa through a gendered lens. And next week in the series, Mauricio Gallardo of University Católica del Norte in Chile will present Measuring Vulnerability to Multidimensional Poverty with Bayesian Network Classifiers. Discussion will be by Stefan Spirlik of the University of Geneva. Please join us, but if you miss an event, you can always catch the reruns in the YouTube channel IIEP GW. Now, without further ado, let me turn it over to Jacob Dirksen in Oxford, who will introduce today's speaker. Jacob.
Thank you, James, and thank you all for joining us for this fourth seminar in this iteration of our series, focused on advances in multidimensional poverty measurement and analysis, with a particular focus on policy applications. And warm greetings from not yet quite well-tempered Oxford to everyone. We're in for a real treat today with a fantastic paper and two even more fantastic colleagues who are joining us as presenter and discussant. First of all, we're extremely privileged to have with us today as presenter Adriana Stankiewicz. Adriana is research associate at the Institute of Economics at the University of Campinas in Brazil, and also works as a consultant in businesses that build multidimensional poverty indices. She holds a PhD in economic development from the University of Campinas, and after her postdoctoral studies at the same university, she also worked on a research project on multidimensional poverty measurement in Brazil for the Brazilian federal government. And on all of this, we'll hear more presently. In addition to multidimensional poverty, her research interests also include inequality of opportunities and rural development. And the paper that Adriana is presenting today examines multidimensional poverty in Brazil, and it does so by employing two so-called poverty identification functions. So what we call the ways in which we identify who is and who is not multidimensionally poor. One of these functions, one of these identification approaches, follows the Alkire-Foster method, whereby the Foster does, of course, stand for none other than our esteemed chair, Professor James Foster. And the second approach is the so-called Permanyer's two-stage identification approach. So who could be better suited as a discussant for this paper than the very person who came up with this approach? We're absolutely delighted that Inaki Permanyer is joining us as discussant for Adriana's paper. Inaki is ICREA research professor working at the Center for Demographic Studies at the Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona, and he has a degree in mathematics as well as a PhD in demography from the UAB. He has more than 40 publications in journals including Demography, PNAS, the Journal of Development Economics, and World Development. And I don't even have the time to list even half of the many academic awards and distinctions Inaki has received over the years, including multiple ERC grants and a Fulbright Fellowship and many more. Thank you both so much for joining us, Adriana and Inaki. We're very happy and privileged to have you with us today. And now, without further ado, over to you, Adriana. Our screens are yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Jakob, Professor James Foster. It's such a pleasure to be here with you today and finally meeting Inaki. And I want to thank the organizers for the opportunity to present our study at this seminar. This is a joint work with Gaston Jolonetsky from the Leeds University Business School, University of Leeds, and Alexandre Gori from the Institute of Economics at the University of Campinas. This article was published in Social Indicators Research, and I will follow the same structure in my presentation. So let's start by looking at some data from the income perspective. In this chart, we have the poverty headcount ratio at international poverty lines of $190 and $550 a day, according to the World Bank estimates. The missing data are from years in which the National Household Sample Survey, in Portuguese, PNAD or PNAD, was not performed. From this perspective, progress was substantial since the 90s. However, after a systematic poverty reduction between 2003 and 2014, an economic recession in 2015-16 reversed this trajectory. In 2019, we had 4.6% of the population surviving on less than $190 a day, almost 10 million people, and 41 million people, or almost 20% of the population, were living below the 550 poverty line. Besides, Brazil is characterized by extreme territorial inequalities, such as income between rural and urban population. No matter what poverty line is used, rural poverty is markedly higher than urban poverty. It's important to mention that Brazil does not have an official poverty line, and the federal government uses different income criteria to select beneficiaries of social of the minimum wage for other purpose, all of monthly household income per capita. In this study, our starting point is the first of the Sustainable Development Goals to end poverty in all its forms everywhere. Because the monetary approach is still predominant in poverty analysis in Brazil, we still don't have a national MPI here, and the rural-urban contrasts have not been examined deeply through a multidimensional lens. We address two main questions. First, what has changed in other dimensions of poverty besides income? And second, has poverty changed evenly within the country? That is, what were the implications for rural-urban inequalities? We analyzed the period 2000-2010 for two main reasons. The first reason is that we have the microdata from the two last demographic censuses, and compared to the National Household Sample Survey, which is the most frequently used data source for poverty studies in Brazil, the main advantage of the census is that it allows us to analyze the smallest administrative unit in the country, which is the municipality. And the second reason is that this is the recent period of most relevant socioeconomic changes in the country, which was particularly favored by the world economic dynamics, but also experienced key social policy initiatives. The aim of our paper is then twofold. We estimate multidimensional poverty measures for Brazil in 2000 and 2010, comparing the results obtained from two methods, the Alkire-Foster or AF method, and the two-state identification approach suggested by our discussant today, Inaki Permanyer, in a very interesting article published in 2019, and which takes into account the substitutability and complementarity within and across dimensions. We also disaggregate the analysis into 5 classes of municipalities, according to the new rural-urban typology proposed by the Brazilian Institute of Geography and Statistics, IBGE, in 2017, based on the degree of urbanization and remoteness. I'm going to detail this in a little while. And here we engage with the literature on rural development. And the main idea is that the proximity to more urbanized regions with better infrastructure facilitates the access to goods and services and job opportunities, besides boosting both agricultural and non-agricultural activities. I just want to briefly mention some points from the literature review on multidimensional poverty measurement, since it is widely known. The deprivation counting method has been extensively used to identify the poor, but there are disagreements regarding the aggregation of different attributes into a scalar index, such as the global MPI. An issue pointed out in the literature is that the counting method implicitly assumes perfect substitutability between indicators. For instance, given the weighting structure of the global MPI, a deprivation in any of the health indicators is equivalent to a deprivation in any of the education indicators. And but the scalar index is required for quantifying the incidence of multiple deprivations among the same individuals, but not sufficient. For instance, the Human Development Index is a scalar index that does not provide any information about the joint distribution of its components, and this is fundamental for social policy planning. As I have already mentioned, most studies in Brazil are limited to income poverty, but it's important to highlight some contributions regarding multidimensional poverty. In 2006, Izete Bagolin and Rodrigo de Avila built a composite index from 4 indicators: essential nourishment, the health, safety, and basic knowledge, to analyze multidimensional poverty among the Brazilian states. Also in 2006, Ricardo Paes de Barros and co-authors constructed the Family Poverty Index, including a total of 48 indicators in 6 dimensions: vulnerability, access to knowledge, access to work, scarcity of resources, child development, and housing deprivation. In the same year, Angela Kageyama and Rodolfo Hoffman combined income with other 3 indicators: piped water, bathroom, and electricity, using accounting approach. And Antonio Márcio Boinain and co-authors in 2013 examined rural poverty through cross-tabulations of deprivations in income and other 16 indicators. All these 3 studies from Barros, Kageyama, and Hoffman, and Boinain co-authors were based on the National Household Sample Surveys. In turn, Barbara Cobo and co-authors, who are researchers from IBGE, in 2014 adapted the poverty measurement method of Mexico's Coneval to the Brazilian demographic censuses of 2000 and 2010, combining income measures and social deprivations to build a multidimensional poverty classification of persons and households, but did not address the differences between rural and urban areas, although they point out this gap. As we use 2 methods to identify the poor, and the AF method is quite well known, I will just point out some definitions to be able to compare the approaches, but trying to make it as simple as possible. So from an achievement matrix and the deprivation cutoffs vector, we create a deprivation matrix which represents individual deprivations in all indicators. The deprivation score, which is the weighted sum of deprivations of each individual, is then calculated. Finally, individuals with the deprivation score higher than the poverty cutoff are identified as multidimensionally poor. In turn, in the 2-stage identification of the poor, the variables or indicators are hierarchically structured in mutually exclusive domains or dimensions. The deprivation matrix is the same of the AF method, but here the identification step requires 2 definitions. First, the deprivation status in each dimension, that is the within dimension identification functions, and second, the overall deprivation across dimensions, or the between dimensions identification function. The main idea here is, first of all, to define a combination of deprivations which represent the lack of a decent living condition in each dimension, instead of counting deprivations across all dimensions. So it's necessary to evaluate the complementarity and substitutability within and between dimensions in order to define the 2 identification functions, which may include any criterion of the counting approach from union to intersection. We understand that this 2-stage approach may contribute to a more precise identification of the population targeted by anti-poverty policies. In sum, while the AF method applies a single poverty cutoff across all dimensions to identify the multidimensionally poor, the 2-stage approach requires the definition of a threshold within each dimension and the threshold between dimensions. In the aggregation step, we use the 3 measures of the AF method: the adjusted headcount ratio, M0 or MPI, and its components: the multidimensional headcount ratio, or the incidence of poverty, H, and the average intensity of multidimensional poverty, or intensity of poverty, A. We used the microdata sample files from the Demographic Census in 2000 and 2010, and we adopted the municipal rural urban typology proposed by IBGE in 2017 with 5 classes of municipalities: predominantly urban, intermediate close to a city, intermediate remote, predominantly rural close to a city, and predominantly rural remote. This typology was proposed as an alternative to the official definition that could be included in the next census, which has been postponed because of the pandemic and is planned for this year. While the official definition of rural and urban areas in Brazil is established by municipal law, the new typology is in line with criteria widely used internationally, such as the OECD typology. This classification considers 3 main criteria: population density, population size, and location. According to the population density and population size, each municipality is classified into predominantly urban, intermediate, or predominantly rural. This table presents the classification based on the combination of these first 2 criteria. And the third criterion, location, is defined in terms of the commuting time to the nearest major urban centers, and it's used to classify intermediate and rural municipalities as close to a city or remote. In 2010, 76% of the total population lived in urban municipalities instead of 84% from the official definition. The spatial distribution of municipalities according to the rural-urban typology across the Brazilian territory shows that the great majority of predominantly urban municipalities are located in the most developed areas of the center-south region and the northeast coast. The intermediate and rural municipalities are evenly distributed among the territory, while those classified as remote are concentrated in the north and part of the northeast region. In this study, the purpose of the measure is to compare the poverty dynamics across groups of rural and urban municipalities between 2000 and 2010. The poverty measurement is based on the capabilities approach of Amartya Sen. In this perspective, minimally adequate living conditions and basic educations are essential requirements to function in society, and therefore compose our multidimensional poverty measure. Our unit of identification and analysis is a person because the availability of the microdata and also because of the ethical premise that education is an individual human right, and it is also established in our federal constitution as a social right. We chose the indicators based on the dimensions of poverty and welfare pointed out in the literature, the Brazilian legislation, and of course, the constraints imposed by the variables investigated in the demographic censuses. As in the global MPI, the weights are equally distributed among the dimensions and equally divided among indicators within each dimension. In the case of the AF method, we estimated the multidimensional poverty measures for all possible values of poverty cutoffs, combining the deprivation indicators and their respective weights. So our MPI has 2 dimensions: standard of living with 6 indicators: water pipes, private bathroom, waste disposal, electricity, durable consumer goods, and overcrowding. And education with 2 indicators and different criteria by age group. The first indicator is school attendance for the 7 to 17 age group and literacy for 18 years and above. And the second one is schooling gap for the 7 to 17 age group and schooling achievement for 9 years and above, taking into account that in Brazil, a child should be literate by the age of 8. Because of the time limitation, I will not detail the deprivation cutoffs, but we can return to them later if necessary. For the same reason, I will not present the correlation and redundancy measures, but they are discussed in the paper. It's important to mention that ideally, the national measure should include at least the same dimensions of the global MPI. However, we were not able to compute the indicators in the health dimension for two reasons. First, the demographic censuses do not provide any information on nutrition. And second, although the census provided information on child mortality in 2010, the same variables were not investigated in 2000. On the other hand, we did include sanitation indicators in the standard of living dimension, which are often strongly correlated to health indicators. In the case of the two-state identification of the poor, we define the within dimension identification function using the intermediate counting approach for the standard of living and the intersection approach for education. We assume that a person is deprived in standard of living if he or she is deprived in at least half of the indicators. In this way, we consider that the existence of water pipes, private bathrooms, electricity, and at least one channel of communication or access to information, radio, TV, or telephone are minimum conditions to enjoy a decent life. And we also assume that the person is deprived in education if he or she is deprived in all indicators with different criteria by age group. So for 7 and 8 years old, the child is not attending school. For 9 to 17 years old, the child or adolescent is not attending school and is illiterate. And for 18 years old or more, the person is illiterate. And the between dimensions identification function is based on the union approach. That is, a person is identified as multidimensionally poor if he or she is deprived in any of the two dimensions. Moving on to the results, let us start by the uncensored headcount ratios, that is the population deprived in each indicator regardless of their poverty status. Despite improvements in living conditions over time, deprivations remain remarkably high, particularly in basic sanitation. In education, we broke down the results according to the Brazilian education system. Elementary education for the 7 to 14 age group, according to the Brazilian legislation on education before 2010, and secondary education for the 15 to 17 age group. And again, in spite of the improvements in all indicators, much remains to be done concerning the school attendance of the 15 to 17 age group, the schooling gap of 2 or more years for students between 9 and 17 years, and the low schooling achievement and illiteracy among the adult population. For example, in 2010, 10%, I want to highlight in 2010 in Brazil, 10% of the population aged 18 years and above was not able to read or write. This figure shows a larger drop in deprivations in intermediate and rural municipalities, although people living in those municipalities are still the most deprived in all indicators. One main change between 2000 and 2010 was the expansion of access to electricity in rural areas. This result may be related to public policies such as the rural electrification program established by the federal government in 2003. In Portuguese is Luz para Todos, or Light for All, and the program had benefited more than 13 million people by the end of 2010. When applying the AF method for the most values of the poverty cutoff, there is a clear distinction between the urban municipalities, the bottom line, and the group of intermediate and rural municipalities for all three measures, H, A, and M0, starting here by the multidimensional head count ratio in both years. These differences, as you can see, narrowed from 2000 to 2010, but poverty remains relatively higher in rural and intermediate municipalities. Disparities are also more pronounced in the incidence than in the intensity of poverty. And an interesting insight comes from the poverty rankings of the classes of rural and intermediate municipalities, considering their location in relation to relevant urban centers. The ranking here in descending order is rural remote, intermediate remote, rural close to a city, intermediate close to a city, and urban municipalities. That is, independently of the poverty cutoff, poverty is higher in remote municipalities when compared to those close to a city, whether they are classified as intermediate or predominantly rural municipalities. In order to check the robustness of our results to alternative poverty cutoffs and poverty measures, we use deprivation curves to verify dominance conditions. The deprivation curves of age, first dominance condition, and M0, the second dominance condition, do not intersect for all poverty cutoffs less than or equal to 75% in 2000 and 2010. Besides checking the dominance conditions, we also tested the statistical significance of the differences between the estimates of two classes of municipalities in the same year and the changes in the poverty estimates over time. For all poverty cutoff K higher than 75%, some of the differences between rural remote and intermediate remote municipalities in each year are not statistically significant. And multidimensional poverty reduction between 2000 and 2010 is statistically significant for all values of K and for all classes of municipalities. Considering the ranking of municipalities, the results from the two-stage identification of the poor are similar to those obtained by the AF counting method. Multidimensional poverty reduced remarkably between 2000 and 2010 in all classes of municipalities, especially in remote municipalities for both H and M0. These two poverty maps show the distribution of multidimensional poverty across the Brazilian municipalities in 2000 and 2010. The darker the color, the worse the indicator, which is the multidimensional head count ratio based on the two-stage identification of the poor. Although the incidence of multidimensional poverty is still higher in the north and northeast regions as income poverty, these regions presented the greatest absolute poverty reductions. In these figures, we compared the multidimensional poverty reduction between 2000 dotted lines and 2010 in solid lines using the AF counting identification of the poor in blue for all values of K and the two-stage identification in red. The difference between the estimates depends on both the poverty identification function and the corresponding values of K. For instance, with full deprivation in education or K equal to 50%, the incidence of poverty in 2010, according to would be 10% according to the AF counting approach, while the two-stage method identified 13% of the population as multidimensionally poor. It's important to emphasize that even though different methods may result in the same head count ratio, different people would be identified as poor. The intensity of poverty remains high according to the two-stage identification method. On average, multidimensionally poor people were deprived in 53% of the weighted indicators in 2010. The estimates of the adjusted headcount ratio for the two-stage method, combining the incidence and the intensity of poverty, show that the poor population experienced 6.8% of the total possible deprivations they could experience in 2010. We also compared the incidence of income poverty and multidimensional poverty. We assume that a person is deprived in income if the monthly household income per capita was up to 140 reais in our currency in 2010, constant values, which was the poverty line for the beneficiaries of the Bolsa Familia program in July 2010, and twice the extreme poverty line. Both income poverty and multidimensional poverty headcount ratios presented similar trends between 2000 and 2010 with significant reductions. However, there are some critical differences between the classes of municipalities. Income poverty fell more markedly in absolute terms in municipalities close to a city, while multidimensional poverty fell more remarkably in remote municipalities. When we look at the joint distribution of the Brazilian population in monetary and non-monetary dimensions of poverty, we can see a clear mismatch between them. From the bottom up, we have both income and multidimensionally poor, only income poor, only multidimensionally poor, and non-poor. For instance, while 25% of the population were identified as poor based on either perspective in 2010, only 6% were simultaneously income poor and multidimensionally poor. Among the classes of municipalities, the overlap of deprivations is higher in rural and remote areas. In 2010, 30% of the population living in rural remote municipalities were both income and multidimensionally poor. This last figure shows the extent of the progress made in poverty reduction between the 2 years for 3 dimensions: standard of living, education, and income. The lack of income remained the main deprivation in the country, while the standard of living, which was the second largest deprivation in 2000, became the lowest one in 2010. On the other hand, the education dimension has advanced slowly. Only a small share of the population is simultaneously deprived in all 3 dimensions, 4.8 million people in 2000 and 1.6 million in 2010. Finally, some concluding remarks. We believe that this study brings in some main contributions to the literature on poverty in Brazil. A proposal of multidimensional poverty measures that take more accurately into account the diverse array of deprivations in the country. We also compared 2 methods, the AF counting identification of the poor and the two-state identification approach, and the intersections with monetary poverty. A broad analysis of multidimensional poverty in Brazil in a period of important socioeconomic changes when income poverty fell significantly. The decomposition by classes of municipalities highlighted huge differences in both the level and dynamics of poverty. Remote municipalities remain relatively poorer from any perspective. Great progress was made in the standard of living, especially in the access to electricity, durable consumer goods, and private bathrooms in the households. However, there are still considerable deprivations in sanitation. And in the education dimension, the school attendance of the 15 to 17 age group and the schooling achievement among the adult population are major challenges. Thank you so much, and I look forward to your comments and discussion.
Well, thank you so much, Adriana. That was incredibly efficient, and not just that, but filled with all kinds of analysis that I can't imagine being able to say so much in such a short period of time. So thank you for your efficiency. And I mean, it's a great illustration of the broad multidimensional approach. And it's wonderful to bring a kind of robustness to the identification side as well. So speaking of the robustness to the identification side, Inaki, do you want to give your discussion?
Okay, do you hear me? Great. Okay, so thank you so much for the invitation. Perhaps I should share my slides. Share here. Okay. So Adriana, let me congratulate you and your colleagues. I think as James just said, I mean, you just did a fantastic job summarizing such a great amount, I mean, a huge amount of information just in 40 minutes. I just have like, you know, nice words for this great paper. I really loved it. I mean, for those who never encountered, you know, multidimensional poverty before, I mean, I would recommend you to read this paper because it really goes through all the issues that are, you know, necessary for practitioners when they want to apply multidimensional poverty measures. It's, you know, so exhaustive. I mean, starting, you know, from the correlation structure with the variables. That's something that Adriana did not present today, but it's in the paper. She just briefly mentioned that, looking at the redundancy of the different indicators that are incorporated into the analysis, doing all sorts of robustness checks, comparison with income poverty measures. And the issue perhaps in which I'm more interested in is these different identification approaches, right? Because basically Adriana was presenting the standards, so to say, Alkire-Foster approach, and I'm very grateful that that she and her co-authors have tried these new approaches suggested, this two-stage identification approach. I'm very grateful for that. I see that as a kind of a proof of concept, if I may say, right? Because when I wrote the paper, it was purely, so to say, theoretical. My aim in that paper was just to make room for the possibility of, you know, playing around with these different degrees of substitutability among indicators, depending on whether they belong to the same dimension or not. But it was just purely, you know, theoretical, just making the room for these possibilities. And in this paper, they just put it into practice, and it was a super interesting exercise, and I loved it. And again, thank you so much for applying this and putting this into practice, because I think it's something that we all proposing new measures are something that we'd like to see, no? That these measures are useful, they can be applied. Of course, the paper has so many things. We cannot cover more ground, but somehow I would have liked, but that's an issue for another paper. I would have liked to see more different ways of applying this very same two-stage identification approach. The authors chose like a very reasonable one, but again, there are many of them, right? So again, if you go deeper into these robustness checks of the different ways into which individuals can be identified as poor or not in this two-stage identification approach, there are many alternatives, right? You choose one, which I liked, but again, I was curious to know more about the different things. Of course, this can lead to a combinatorial explosion of different possibilities. I am aware of that, but it's something that perhaps in the future it would be worth, right, to look into that. That's something that perhaps I missed somehow, but perhaps this is a bias because of my interest in this issue, right? And of course, then it's very complicated, because when I was writing this paper, I just wanted to make room for this possibility of making the different attributes complements or substitutes. But then I have to agree with that when you have to, to put this into practice, then it becomes complicated to decide whether these pairs of attributes are complements or substitutes. And then there's ample room for improvement, ample room for research in that line, because it's a really complicated issue. I think you took like a very wise decision in this paper, but again, there's plenty of scope for further research into that line, right? Just some sparse comments on other issues related to the paper. You used these demographic censuses, which I loved. I mean, being working in a center, a demographic center in Barcelona, we are very big fans of demographic censuses. And I'm quoting these. There are sources that they're collecting dust in the shelves. That's an expression I took from a paper I read some years ago, where basically in that paper they were sort of perhaps complaining, right? Saying that these are huge data sets that are not largely used. And this is a very good example, this paper by Adriana and colleagues, where these sources of data can be very useful to produce, amazing results, right? And the fact that you can go deep and look into municipal level detail of multidimensional poverty, it's really impressive, right? I mean, these maps are really beautiful. My impression is that they're extremely useful. This is something that Adriana perhaps did not mention, but if I remember correctly, there are like 5,500 municipalities in Brazil. So it's a huge amount of municipalities that she's comparing. So that's a tremendous job that you have to, to carry out to be able to perform these comparisons, right? And I think one of the beautiful things of this approach is that it allows identifying, we hear what I call these deprivation profiles. I think this was not stated in the paper, but it doesn't matter. I mean, basically it's very useful to distinguish what she was showing with these Venn diagrams, right? Looking at the intersections between these different combinations. I think this is, well, one of the nice things of this multidimensional approach, because you can identify, I mean, the typology of the poor, right? I mean, you can identify, I know how many millions of individuals that might be poor in Brazil, but it's not the same to be deprived just in education or just in income or just in health, well, not health, but the different combinations, and being able to disentangle these different combinations, I think it's like a great advantage. It's something that's great from this multidimensional poverty approach, right? And again, of course, it's very useful to highlight and with these highlight the dimensions where the different municipalities are experiencing more or less progress. And I think in this regard, the paper is super interesting. I mean, the findings that they report are very useful and say, well, we have made a lot of progress in these kind of dimensions, but not in the other ones, specifically in the income dimension ones. So again, very useful, very, very practical to pinpoint like very high precision policies for the eradication of poverty, right? Another issue which I liked about the paper is that the basic unit of analysis is not the household, but the individual. And here I say that it's interesting yet limiting, right? It's interesting because, as Adriana very nicely said, I mean, it's preferable to have like the individual as the basic unit of analysis to make these comparisons more meaningful. But at the same time, they encountered this problem with if you want to have like the different indicators available for the same individuals, then they have to sacrifice this health dimension, right? Which is something that I'm highlighting in the next slide, which, oops, let's move this here. It's a pity that this health dimension is missing, which of course that there are trade-offs, right? The good thing about the individual level is that you can have finer detail, but you lose this health dimension. If you wanted to incorporate the health dimension, well, you might not have the individual at the basic unit of analysis, but you might have perhaps the municipality, which is not bad. I mean, you have like 5,500 municipalities, which nevertheless, it gives you a lot of information. And at the end of the day, this is many of the findings that you report in the paper are based in these municipalities, right? So anyway, that's it. Just very tiny things here. I titled these slide limitations, but it's between quotation marks because it's not really limitations. I mean, I love the paper. I mean, it was super exhaustive, and it's not feasible in a single paper to cover as much more ground than you did, right? But just very tiny things. One of the things that I perhaps missed is just very simple standard national level estimates of poverty in Brazil. You were giving like very detailed accounts of multidimensional poverty levels by types of municipality, separating in kinds of urban or rurality. But then, if I remember correctly, there were no like very simple estimates at the national level. You had some poverty headcount measures uncensored, but then it would have been nice just to add another curve. You have like these 5 types of municipalities. Perhaps it would have been nice to add just the whole country to look at the trends, but that's it, right? Then another issue I'm highlighting here is that you're comparing 2000 and 2010 by these different kinds of municipalities, and to some extent it might be happening that because of population growth, some rural areas or some urban areas, I don't know, they might be growing their population numbers, they might be growing at different rates. And this has a compositional effect, right? When you're looking at poverty, depending on whether you're looking at absolute or relative numbers, you might have like this conflicting evidence, right? And in this regard, it would be nice, but of course, for another paper, I mean, for this one, it's more than enough. It has been published, so that's great. But in the future, I think it would be interesting to look at, these potential effects of population growth, differential population growth by types of municipality, right? There's this issue of the health I mentioned, which is a pity. I guess with the demographic census, you, Adriana, I think you mentioned it very quickly, you should have access to this child mortality data, which somehow, of course, it's not like an individual level indicator, but it should perhaps be enough to allow you to say something at municipal level, right? You should be able to make an estimate of child mortality at municipal level and somehow to fill this gap. But again, this is a trade-off, right, between coverage and having the data at the individual level. And then I was wondering, just thinking out loud, about the quality of this income data that you took from the demographic census. I'm not an expert, in Brazil by no means, but sometimes I've heard that the demographic census might be very useful, perhaps for these non-pecuniary dimensions of well-being. They're very good at measuring household characteristics and educational attainment and so on. But when it comes to income data, I'm not so sure about the data quality. I've heard that, there might be huge underreporting of incomes across families in those censuses. So I was wondering, just thinking out loud, to what extent the quality of this data could be double checked against other sources. I don't know, I guess there might be some other income sources, surveys in Brazil against which you could compare. I don't know, but that was an issue. And just let me, since I have been invited, just let me speculate a little bit about the future, right? About different possible ways forward. And this is just pretty much related with the kind of research I've been doing lately, but it doesn't come out of the blue. It's pretty much related to the kind of research that Adriana was showing to us, looking at multidimensional poverty levels at municipal level in Brazil. It reminded me of something similar that I did some years ago, which was looking at a municipal level human development index based on the same source of information. It was demographic census. In this map, I'm not showing Brazil, I'm showing Mexico. But the idea was pretty much the same. I just took the demographic census in Mexico. They had data, I think, from the 1990, 2000, 2010, pretty much the same years as Adriana was showing us. And on the basis of this demographic census, I came up with a measure that somehow was estimating like the municipal level human development index, okay? And this is something that I did some years ago, which I think was super interesting for me. But at that point, I thought it would be yet another exercise that might end up, collecting dust in the shelves, right? But because, very often you like to enlarge the analysis to other countries, but you don't have the time. But then I was lucky enough to meet a colleague in the Netherlands that helped me to enlarge this analysis And rather than looking at a specific country, we were able to cover the whole world. We're looking at something which we call the Subnational Human Development Index, which tries to cover as many countries as possible. I think we have like 165, where we were able to estimate the Human Development Index at subnational level for all those countries. The downside of this approach is that we don't have that much of a detail as Adriana had for Brazil, right? In Brazil, I think she had like 5,500 municipalities. In our example, for example, in Brazil, I think we have just 23 or 24 states, if I remember correctly, but there's a trade-off, right? But anyway, my point is that Brazil is a very special country in that at the municipal level, it has estimates not just of multidimensional poverty, as Adriana was showing, but they also have their own estimates of the Human Development Index, right? They have their own estimates of the HDI for these 5,500 municipalities. I think it's in the 1990s, 2000 and 2010. And I was looking at the data, and this is what I observed. I was plotting the kernel density estimates of this municipal level Human Development Index for these 5,000 and something municipalities, looking at them over time. And it's like a very funny shape where you can see like this double peak. It's a twin peak distribution, which when you move it, when you look at it over time, it's shifting, right? It's increasing over time, but it seems as if these two peaks are never closing the gap, right? So it looks as if we have like two Brazils in terms of this municipal Human Development Index. So both are apparently seeming to improve over time, but the gap doesn't seem to close. And even you might say that there might be like an increasing level of polarization, you know, because these two peaks, apparently they are more and more concentrated over time, but I haven't double checked that, right? Well, the point is that I would be pretty much interested, and I think it's something that is a very interesting way forward, is to take the analysis by Adriana, looking at this municipal level multidimensional poverty, and try to match it with the municipal level HDI, right? Because we're looking at different parts of the distribution. This HDI would be like an average level of the welfare distribution for each municipality, whereas with the MPI, we're looking at the bottom, right? And of course, we might be expecting to have like a positive correlation between the two indicators, but it would be super interesting to look exactly at how this relationship looks like, okay? So that's one of the things I would be interested in, you know, when you've had to make a follow-up of this research, just try to relate multidimensional poverty and this multidimensional welfare as measured by the Human Development Index, right? And in this regard, I looked at something similar, not exactly the same, with a colleague that you might know, Nikolai Zupa, that also is working at OPHI. We recently published a paper that's forthcoming in Regional Studies, where we're looking also at this Subnational Human Development Index, and we're wondering whether the inequality reduction that we have been observing in this global Subnational Human Development Index is accompanied by a reduction in regions where there's underdevelopment, right? So we kind of created like a global measure of poverty in terms of the HDI. So we set it a threshold, which I don't remember which that was, but basically we said that if there's a subnational region that does not attain a given level of human development, it's underdeveloped. And then we looked at the evolution of this share of regions falling below these human development thresholds at the global level, looking at over time and comparing that with the evolution of inequality. And in this analysis, we observed that the trends are not as simple as one might expect. Here in this graph, we observed that in the last 10 years, underdevelopment in this Subnational Human Development Index has not decreased over time, despite the fact that if you look at the overall shape of the distribution of this Subnational Human Development Index, we're observing like a compression of the distribution. Inequality apparently is going down, but the tail of the distribution is very fat, right? It doesn't disappear. So anyway, I think that would be like, I mean, of course, it's a biased opinion. I'm very much fond of this kind of analysis, but I will encourage you to go beyond and look at the relationship between these kind of indicators, right? And like a final slide, I was wondering whether it would be possible to go towards like this Subnational Multidimensional Poverty Index. I know there's a big effort in OPHI to create subnational multidimensional poverty indices that they're covering many countries in the developing world. But I was wondering whether it might be possible to just, one go step beyond and try to cover, as I did with this HDI, right? To cover the vast majority of countries in the world and be able to explore this kind of relationship between multidimensional poverty and human development, just to compare like these different parts of the distribution. And I'm going to stop here. I think I took too much time. Thank you very much, Adriana. Great job. Thank you so much.
Inaki, I let you go on, no problem. I thought you had lots to say. I particularly enjoyed of course, the decomposition analysis. That is crucial here. You're highlighting some of the abilities of measures to be divided across population subgroups, and that is entirely policy relevant at that point, because you can then distinguish and target. Let me just ask the audience to be reminded that our Q&A function is open. That means you may dump your question right there by typing it in. That would be great. Meanwhile, I wanted to turn it back to Adriana for any comments she wanted to make on the discussant. No problem. You can say what you want. You can tell him he's great. You can tell him I'm very upset. Now is your chance.
Thank you very much, Professor James and Inaki, for your very kind comments on this study. And Inaki, you asked about the quality. Let me try to say something here about the quality of the income data from the demographic census. And we know that in Brazil, both the demographic census and the household survey, sample survey, the income is underestimated, particularly for the higher incomes, but it's the data source that we have. So we have, I have just confirmed, because the number of municipalities is always growing in Brazil. Oh. So today we have 5,570 municipalities. And
this complicates comparisons over time.
Yeah, that's true. And you were absolutely right when you mentioned the problem with the issue of the population growth. And the health dimension, we have data on child mortality only for the demographic census in 2010. So we could do something for at the household levels in this case. And,
let me just drop in. Since I know this, I think it's IBGE, this is the Brazilian of geography. IBG, yes. They produce the subnational HDI that I showed you. And I guess the health dimension must be based on what might they base their health dimension at the municipal level? What do you remember? I thought it was child mortality, but
I have to check, but I don't think, I think it's a foundation in Brazil. It's not the Institute of Statistics that estimates this municipal index, but I will check this and I will tell you later.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
Is that all? No more response?
We are looking now for, waiting for the demographic census this year, 2022, because it's late because of the pandemic. So maybe we can go forward and continue to study this.
Well, fantastic. We do have a question that I wanted to pose to you. We had, of course, touched upon the issue of population growth, a very important thing. Of course, there have been many techniques designed to understand, shift share analysis and so on, to understand what's going on with population growth. To what extent is it a real increase in poverty? To what extent is it purely demographic? What are the sources? But there was a question given in chat, which was sent to me directly. One crucial aspect in an analysis of poverty changes over a decade is demographic shifts, for example, migration patterns. So go even further, the migration patterns or other demographic shifts. Does your analysis touch on this? How do you think this could be incorporated into your assessment? And of course, started out by saying, great presentation.
Thank you very much. This is a very important issue, but we did not really think about it. And so maybe the next study.
Yeah, good
Great
answer.
idea, and very difficult to deal with that.
Very, very good. I had a question for you since in the early days of our exploring MPI, we did speak to a number of officials in different governments, including, I believe, one Teresa Cambello at Brazil a long time ago. At that point, it appeared that income would be one of the dimensions of the forthcoming MPI. Of course, that all was gone very shortly afterwards. But my question to you is, to what extent did you think of going against the norm? The norm being not including income dimension versus, the norm being not including, yes, income-based measures. To what extent did you think that you might include income into your MPI? And why did you choose one way or the other? Just a curiosity, since it seemed the policy community was so engaged with income that it was hard to leave it out. It was very similar to Mexico in that sense.
That's a good question. And I ask you, I don't know if you remember, but in 2015, when you were in Leeds with Sabine, I asked you the same question.
Not fair.
Remember when you were in Leeds to launch the book? And
I do remember.
June 2015, I asked you the same question. This is a very good question, but we are always thinking about it. And I read the report of the Commission on Global Poverty, the Atkinson
Yes.
Commission, and basically we followed the recommendation of having an MPI as a complement to income measures. But in Brazil, income poverty is still higher. It's very important, but for me, it's clear that we really need to coordinate public policies, because sometimes we have progress in income, but we don't have at all in education mainly and sanitation. So, and with the pandemic, these inequalities and deprivations were terrible and amplified. Access to internet also. So we have to take into account all these non-monetary dimensions urgently.
Yes, and it's a matter of policy that those can actually be dealt with. You can actually imagine focusing on one of these indicators or an entire dimension and making a difference through policy action. I've always given the example of how to make a difference in a income-based poverty measure, and it's very restrictive. It's either transfer or try to grow more, which everyone's already trying to do. So I see one response, and that's not a sustainable response for most countries for the long haul, maybe in the short run, maybe even the medium run. So I think that investing in people in the dimensions they're deprived carries a good deal of policy support across the world. And so that's why I suppose we have restricted and focused on non-income dimensions. I did have another question for you, since the audience has decided to let me be the questioner in chief here. I I noticed that you chose one particular configuration of Inaki's approach. And of course, that's what one has to do. But if you could explain what your thoughts were in that particular choice you made, and what criteria or what way of thinking led you to that. Since, as Inaki said, there are many other approaches one could have adopted which are within the framework, including even, you know, having a AF, I suppose, to an extent, in a weird way. But go ahead.
Okay, thank you for your question. What we thought was that standard of living and education minimum conditions, basic conditions, were essential. So it's not only one or the other, but we need both. So that was the main idea, and particularly within the standard of living dimension, we have two indicators. Waste disposal, which is very critical because in rural areas we do not have any garbage collection, and overcrowding is a difficult indicator because not necessarily more than 2 or 3 people in a room is a problem. It may be a choice, and we should respect that. And depending on the criteria, for example, if they are children or depending on age and other issues. So not necessarily deprivation in overcrowding indicator and waste disposal, because there are alternatives, should be considered as deprivation in the whole dimension. So we took into consideration all these issues. And education, I insist, for me is the main problem in Brazil, because we should be thinking about poverty of opportunities. And if we don't invest in education, what we can do?
I see what you're saying. I do have, of course, a question of how this interacts with substitution or complements and what that really means, because whose complements or substitutes? Is it the policymakers? Is it the people on the ground? And what if they're different across different regions in the ground, et cetera, et cetera? So the complication becomes a bit high at that point. But nonetheless, as with anything, it's really useful to put down a way of thinking, propose it, and let others see it, interpret it. So in that sense, I really appreciate your adding the robustness to the original method. I'm not sure if the original method will survive forever, but it is at least policy helpful to be able to decompose because it's additive. But that's neither here nor there. I wanted to say that we're about near our witching hour of 12:15 my time, 15 after your time. And I just wanted to say what a wonderful presentation, great comments. Really appreciated your being here today, and hope you come back some other time for our wonderful seminar, our series on multidimensional poverty indices. Thank you both very much. Bye-bye now.
Thank you, my pleasure.
Thank you, audience.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.